Welcome to Bible Study Hub. I'm Anne, and I'm so glad that you're with us as we continue our study in the book of Genesis tonight. Finally, I feel like we've been waiting as long as Abraham and Sarah for the birth of Isaac. It's been almost as long. So we finally get to that tonight. But just to give us a running start from where we left off last week, we were talking about Abraham and Sarah journeying in the land of Gerar with King Abimelech. And Abraham and Sarah kind of lost faith again that God would be faithful to his promise and his word. And they claimed that Sarah was his sister instead of his wife. And it was a great big problem. And God actually threatened to kill Abimelech because he had taken Sarah as his wife. And Abimelech said, whoa, 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 I didn't know. And what we ended up with last week was that Abraham actually had to act as priest to pray for Abimelech so that God would forgive him. And if you missed that, because if you missed it and you're like, wait a minute, Abraham really knowingly committed a sin. Abimelech just sort of inadvertently committed a sin. Why does Abraham get to pray for him? July 25th, 2022, go back and listen to that one because it's really interesting why God would have done it that way. I don't want to get into it now because we covered it last week. But tonight, we move on and we get to experience now the birth of Isaac. So let's dive right into it. We are in Genesis chapter 21, and we're going to go through verses 1 to 7. It says, the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore him, just in case you're unclear, it was Sarah, Isaac. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. And I just have to stop and laugh along with Sarah because this is the quintessential woman right here. Whose old age? His old age. Did you pick that up? Sarah doesn't say, I bore him a son in my old age. Oh no. Abraham's the old one. Sarah's not, she's not admitting to that. It just made me laugh when I read that. So anyway, Abraham is 100, Sarah is 90. That's respectable to have babies at this age. Obviously, only God could do something like that. So they name him Isaac or Yitzhak in Hebrew, which means he laughs. They've waited 25 years since God had promised. 25. And that's just since God had promised. She was already confirmed barren by that time. How many years prior to that had Sarah just wished and hoped that maybe somehow, some way she would have a child? Was it 50 years? I don't know. A long, long time. So we have talked about how God made this couple wait and wait and wait. 25 years is a long time to wait for God to do what he said he was going to do. And you had some great feedback as to why that was. Character building, an example to us, something that only God could do. It was a miraculous birth. All of those things, great. You gave me great answers. Let me just throw one more idea out there that kind of like, if we zoom out a little bit, we look at the big picture, and that is this. The Jewish people, you could characterize in a generalization in a number of different ways. People who have been oppressed would definitely be a way to characterize them. People who have been kicked out of their land, definitely a way to characterize them. But another way to do it would be to say they were a people and are a people who have been characterized by intense, long, waiting periods that span not just centuries, but millennia. I mean, you think about the amount of waiting that's gone on. I mean, 25 years is nothing compared to what we're about to talk about. 430 years they were in Egypt as slaves before God had Moses take them out, rescue them. That's a long time. Between right now, Abraham and the birth of Isaac, and the birth of their Messiah, Jesus Christ, the line of Abraham and Isaac, 2,000 years. Between the birth of their Messiah, and now another 2,000 years. And we are still not to the fulfillment of the promise that God gave Abraham about the land and what would be his. That has never come into fulfillment so far. We are still waiting for that. That's 4,000 years waiting for that promise to be fulfilled. Now, God is not slow in fulfilling his promises. It just seems slow to us as people, but we know he will do it. So I think that this is like a microcosm, if you kind of pan out and you look at the situation, kind of a microcosm of the Jewish people, what is to come. Like you almost want to jump in here and say to Abraham, make sure you warn Isaac and tell him to warn his descendants after him. You guys are going to have a lot of waiting. So get used to it. And then I just think too, as we as Christians kind of hopped into the middle of this and at the time of Jesus and thereafter. So we ourselves have been waiting for 2,000 years as Gentile believers for the fulfillment of the promise. Seems awfully long to us, but think of what it must feel like to the Jewish people to have it double that. Wow. So anyway, let's move on from there. We now got the son of promise. Everything is going great. I mean, what could go wrong? Well, let's find out. Verses 8 to 11. And the child, Isaac, grew and was weaned. And Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. Real quick, right there, a great feast. I just wish that God had given us more detail. I have a feeling with the vast wealth that Abraham had by this time, that this vast feast was akin to like a celebrity Hollywood wedding of our day. It was fabulous, and he spared no expense. It was the party of the year. Just guessing. But Sarah saw that the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, this would be Ishmael, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. So Ishmael is laughing. So Sarah said to Abraham, cut out this slave woman with her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. And the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. So we think Isaac was 2-3 years old, somewhere in there, to be weaned, which would make Ishmael 16 or 17 years old. Now, we're not given any specifics really about like what was going on here. And I even read some commentators that said, Ishmael was just partying and having a fun time and laughing, and Sarah got mad. I have a hard time believing that because her reaction is really, really severe. What you kind of picture going on here was Ishmael taunting Isaac. Maybe he was making him cry and laughing about it. Maybe he was making fun of Isaac and laughing about it. We're not really told, but whatever it was, it really, really made Sarah very, very angry. Emily's asking a good question, and I think autocorrect did a little thing there. So I'm going to fix it myself. Why is weaning so important? Did that mark something? That is a great question, Emily. And I brought it up to say, I don't actually know the answer to that. Here's Margie's response is weaning meant leaving babyhood, like the transition later to adolescence. That makes sense to me. It was a really big deal. I guess it was a milestone, maybe that they marked a whole lot more flamboyantly than we tend to mark it in our own culture. But that's a great question. If anybody knows for sure. Autocorrect. I know autocorrect. It's out to get us sometimes. All right. So back to the passage, though. So Sarah is so angry that she will not even use Hagar or Ishmael's name. She's referring to the son of that slave woman of yours. So Abraham is once again kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. Ishmael is his son. In fact, just not that many chapters ago, we remember that Abraham went to God and said, before, Isaac was conceived, I've got Ishmael. Can he just be the son of promise? Can he just be the chosen one? And God said, no, the chosen one is coming through Sarah. This is not the chosen one. So Abraham clearly really loved Ishmael. I mean, this was his own flesh and blood. And now Sarah is saying, you send him and his mother away. They are not going to have anything to do with Isaac. They are not going to share in his inheritance. And I want them gone. And remember, this isn't just gone like, I'll text you when you get there. This isn't gone like, well, we can still be friends on Facebook or Instagram. This is gone. Like, I will never see you again. Gone. So Abraham's heart is shattered at the thought of losing his son, as any of us parents would be at the thought of having to say a permanent goodbye to one of our children. I can't even imagine something like that. And it just kind of brought me back. Remember how Ishmael was conceived because Sarah and Abraham were just like, we can help God. We can figure this out for him. Let's do it our way, and it will help move things along. And I know that they just thought, if we just had a child, any means, any way, we will finally be happy. We will have what we want. And that very thing that they thought they wanted has brought so much strife to the family and heartache to Abraham in particular. And I just thought, how many things that we think we have to have, that we want desperately, that we try to move the pieces of our lives around to somehow make it happen, turn out to be that thing that eventually brings us quite a bit of heartache. Something to think about. Well, let's go on to verses 12 to 14. But God said to Abraham, be not displeased because of the boy, and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you. So God says, just put it aside, do what she says. And then God gives his explanation. For through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring. So, I'm going to take care of Ishmael too. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. So his heart is broken, and you can imagine the scene. I mean, he has to tell them, you have to go. Goodbye. I love you. I'll never see you again. Was Ishmael crying? I mean, was Hagar begging him not to do this? This had to have been a very heart-wrenching experience for him. Kind of interesting. Well, let's go on. It says verses 15 to 21, when the water in the skin was gone, she, Hagar, put the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down down opposite of him, a good ways off, about the distance of a bow shot. For she said, let me not look on the death of my child. And as she sat opposite of him, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Up, lift up the boy, and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. It was already there. God just let her see it. And she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. So he became an archer. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife from him from the land of Egypt. Okay, now if you're me, if you think like me, you read all of that and you say to yourself, that kid is 16 or 17 years old. She's treating him like a small child. I mean, he's spoken of like a child here. I mean, I kind of got my hackles up. I said to myself, well, if I have a 16 or 17-year-old son, he better be bringing me water. I don't think it's going to be the opposite way. I mean, he ought to be taking care of his mother by this time. The kid is an adult, basically. Why is she coddling him like this? I mean, could he not take care of things? But then it hit me. Anybody else? Hit the like button if you're like, yep, tracking with you there, Ann. Then it hit me. Lifespans at this time, as we've talked about, are at least twice, if not a little bit more than twice, what they are today. Abraham himself lives to be 175 years old. That's a long time. And he may not have lived the longest of anybody on the planet at that time. It's very possible that there were people who were living to 180, 185. Maybe some people made it to 200. We're not sure. But at least twice as long as the expected lifespan is now in 2022 in our world. So, as we were saying about Sarah, that, last week we talked about how she was a almost 90-year-old woman taken by Abimelech as his wife. And we were like, really? She as far as the aging process went, was probably more 45, 50-ish. Because when you think about this, there's no way that 100 years old at this point in time in the passage is the equivalent of 100 years old in our day. There's just no way. Nobody who's 100 today has a chance at living 75 more years. I mean, not even remotely. 100 years old is really a long life. So what we can say is the aging process was much slower than it is today. It has sped up considerably. So if 175 is, say, I don't know, 80 in today's terms ish, somewhere in there, 80 to 90, 75 to 90, then that would make Ishmael in today's terms, what, like 8, 7, 8, 9, somewhere in that range. So in that case, this totally makes sense, doesn't it? That he is still a child. In fact, even backing up, it makes more sense that he was making fun of Isaac or making Isaac cry. You would expect that out of like a 7, 8-year-old. You don't really expect that much out of like a 17-year-old. That's a little bit more far-fetched for me to conceive of. But give me a 7 or 8-year-old, oh, all day long, especially if they're jealous of their baby brother or sister. Yeah, they'll do stupid things like that. So that's where I think we're landing on this. And that is why he is dehydrated and she's lifting him up and putting him under a tree. I mean, you can totally see this going on. So anyway, it appears as though Hagar has the sense of direction that I have, which is 0. And so she's trying to get to Egypt. That's where she's from. That's where she ends up getting a wife for Ishmael from. So since she's headed south here, we assume the only place she would ever have to go would be Egypt. That's where she still has family, maybe some friends left. She wouldn't have anywhere else to go. So she is right on the edge of the Negev desert here, in a place, by the way, that is even today known for its wells. Because it's so dry and so arid in this place, there's not like ponds and rivers and lakes everywhere. The only water source is going to come from wells, and they still do have that. Yeah. Okay. So Margie says, oh, she has a grandson who's 9, and sometimes he cries as well. So yeah, I mean, I don't think any of us know of a 9-year-old that is not prone to crying. So that all kind of makes sense. So anyway, God opens her eyes, shows her a well that is already there. And isn't that like our God sometimes? Like there's something right in front of you, you're not seeing it, and he opens your eyes to see it. That's what he does. And so Ishmael grows up, he becomes an archer, and he marries a woman from Egypt. He will go on to have 12 sons, which we will read about in a little while. Emily's saying, was Hagar shunned for being a single mother? Emily, you asked the best questions. I don't definitively know the answer to that. She would have been, I believe, considered sort of concubine status to Abraham. So while she wasn't, I mean, he technically married her, but she obviously wasn't like his first choice of wife. I don't know that they had that arrangement viewed as single motherhood. Although when he kicked her out, I guess she would have been a single mother. And I don't know how the Egyptians would have handled that. So great questions. Keep asking them. Even if I don't know the answers, I appreciate the questions and they really make me think too. Susie says, I love that God still had mercy on her and her son. I do too, Susie. You just see such compassion from our God. There are people who will say things about the God of the Old Testament, and they will say he was a vengeful, wrathful God, and then almost like God changed, then he became this merciful God in the New Testament. You can't read it in depth and ever come to that conclusion, because you see both God's justice and his mercy in both the Old and in the New Testaments, and we appreciate him in all of his fullness and who he is. Well, let's go on to verses 22 to 24. At that time, Abimelech, and I think it's Phicol, the commander of his army, said to Abraham, God is with you in all that you do. Now, therefore, swear to me here by God that you will not deal falsely with me. Oh, I wonder how he came up with that idea. Or with my descendants, or with my posterity. But as I have dealt kindly with you, so you will deal with me and with the land where you have sojourned. And Abraham said, I will swear. He says, okay, you got it. It's a testimony. So as we talked about last week, Abimelech originally tried to establish sort of this like treaty through marriage, this alliance, maybe is a better word, through marriage with Sarah. Obviously that went badly. That did not work out. So now he's coming back. He's circling back and he says to Abraham, I still want to form an alliance with you. So let's cut a covenant together. And I want you to promise me that you will be honest with me, deal with me rightly, not falsely, you weasel. And then I will also make that promise to you. And let's make it to our descendants as well, so that we kind of protect each other's interests, and we'll be friends and everything will be smooth sailing. And so, Abraham says, great, sounds good to me. So, verses 25 to 26, when Abraham reproved Abimelech about a well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized, Abimelech said, I do not know who has done this thing. You did not tell me, and I have not heard of it until today. So after initiating the covenant, Abraham kind of addresses a grievance that it looks like maybe he was just going to originally let go. But he says, okay, since we're in covenant now, I just want you to know that I dug a well and your guys came along and they took it. And it's not theirs, it's mine, but they claim it's theirs. And I'm kind of mad about that. And Abimelech does what Abimelech seems to always do, which is, I didn't know. He just claims ignorance. In his defense, he didn't know, but he says, okay. So just to kind of sum up the rest of this chapter, I'm not going to read all these verses. It's a little bit in the weeds, but basically a synopsis is Abraham and Abimelech cut this covenant together, and Abraham ends up giving Abimelech 7 female lambs, which are called ewes, which kind of puzzles Abimelech. He's like, what's up with the lambs? I mean, thank you, but I don't understand. And Abraham just says, those are just a signal of the agreement that we have, that the well is mine. This water belongs to me. So I'm giving you lambs to kind of like ratify that. Abimelech says, good, done. All right, let's move on to chapter 22. Now, between 21 and 22, about 20 years have passed. We don't know really anything about those 20 years, except that Isaac is growing up. So he would be a young man. Again, if you half that, sort of, he may be about 12-ish in as far as development today would go. But numerically, he would be about 23 years old. So you can imagine Ishmael is long gone. Isaac has just brought laughter and joy to his parents as the son of the promise, and everything is going along fine. And it's like smooth sailing. I mean, what could possibly go wrong now, right? Let me go over to the comments real quick here. Oh, yep. Hello, those of you who are just joining us. All right. Well, let's pick it up at verses 1 to 2 of chapter 22. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Whoa. Okay, things just got real heavy here. The key to understanding this passage is that even though Abraham is the character in focus, and so is Isaac, we have sort of a dual thing, but primarily Abraham, really. The spotlight is on him. This story is more broadly also very, very, very much about God. It's kind of like the book of Job, where Job is the main character, but if you pan out from the book, you get the sense that God is really and truly the main thing in the book, as he is in the entire Bible. So even though the story, yes, is about Abraham intrinsically, it's also very much about God. If you don't understand that, then this type of a passage can make God out to be some kind of cruel, uncaring, unfeeling, some would even say abusive deity. And there are those out there who would accuse God of being that, not just here, but throughout the whole Old Testament. They will say terrible things about God and accuse him of terrible things because they do not understand the depth and the richness of the passage and what is really going on. So we are going to get into that tonight. But let's back up for just a second. This is all about relationship. Even though it sounds like God is giving like this big order. If you kind of get into the nuances of the Hebrew language, you find out that when God calls to Abraham and Abraham says, "Here I am," it's not just roll call. It's not like when your teacher used to call off names like Ralph here, Christine here. It's not that. This is a submissive relational response. The best way I can think to describe it is when my brother and I were little, before my sister was born, we were little kids. My parents trained us that when we were home and one of them would call us from another room, our response had to be coming in a nice tone, like coming. And then we would hop up from whatever we were doing and we would run to wherever the parent was. That was ingrained in us to do that way. And it was I guess just a nice symbol of a great attitude of kind of at your service. What do you need? And then we would be told what to do or asked a question or whatever, or time to go, whatever it was. But that was to be our response. And my parents did a great job of training us to do that. That's the best way I can describe this. It's almost like God says, Abraham, and he pops up, coming. What do you need? What can I do for you? That's kind of the response in that. Also, when God says, take now your son, again, in English, we don't get the fullness of the nuance of the Hebrew, but this is not a harsh order. This is a relational request. The word please is not in it, but it feels like it has a please with it. This is God and Abraham in relationship with each other, I guess is what I'm trying to say. This is not some mad, mean, abusive deity looking down on this poor guy saying, hey, and Abraham going, oh, what? Sacrifice your son. That is not the tone of the passage at all. This is God saying, Abraham, and Abraham, oh, coming, yes, what can I do for you? And God saying, would you offer your son? Would you do that for me? That's more the feeling that we want to get here. Now, let's talk a little bit about the land of Moriah. Emily is asking a question. Did he call Isaac his only son? Did God call Isaac his only son? Yeah, he did. He did. I think you are thinking along the same lines that I'm thinking. Mount Moriah. In fact, let me go over here for a second. I'm going to bring up a picture. Have you ever heard of Mount Moriah? Do you know where that is today? I will show you a picture. Here it is. Do you recognize that? What you're looking at, friends, is Jerusalem. And that is the Temple Mount, which is located on Mount Moriah. It was probably, we're not sure exactly, 2 to 3 football fields from that area that you're looking at, that Jesus was crucified on a cross for our sins on Mount Moriah. It's a vast area, as you can see. It's not just where the Temple Mount is, although you can see it. If you see that mosque there, that is also located on the Temple Mount, as you're probably aware. So God asks Abraham to sacrifice his son, his only son, his son that he loves, on this mountain. Before we read the rest of this, I want to just kind of pan out and get the big picture. To back to Emily's point, verse 2 again. God says to him, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. I want to zoom in on something. Take your son, your only son, whom you love. As I was saying, sometimes we go in for the detail and then we pan out for the big picture when we study the Bible. And as I was reading this passage, really for the first time, all of a sudden, those words just hit me like a ton of bricks, because all of a sudden it occurred to me, I've heard those words in other places of the Bible, such as Matthew 3:17, after Jesus's baptism, where the heavens open and God says, and behold, a voice from heaven says, this is my beloved son, with whom I am well pleased. It reminded me of Luke 9:34 after the transfiguration. This is my son, the chosen one, or some translations say the blessed one. John 3:16, For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. Or 1 John 4:9, and this, the love of God was made manifest among us, that God sent his only son into the world so that we might live through him. That's not all the verses. That is just some of the verses. So God, this omniscient God who planned out salvation before the foundation of the world. I mean, he's had it in his mind since eternity past. He sees it all, and he creates a picture here. And this is why I want you to know this is not God being abusive or asking something horrendous of Abraham. This is God almost himself stepping into the situation in the future. Do you feel the heart of God here? Do you sense the connection that God has to what he is asking Abraham to do? By the way, Abraham has no concept of what is actually going on. He does not know that the God of the universe who is telling him to do this is inserting himself in a way, in a picture, into what Abraham is being asked to do. That God is saying, I'm not just asking you to sacrifice your son, your only son, your beloved son. I'm there with you because I will sacrifice my son, my only son, my beloved son in this very location. About 2,000 years from now, that will be my son. Do you remember us talking about the topic of like a type in the Bible? That not like, oh, that's a type of apple, meaning it's just one of many. Not that kind of type. A type being a foreshadow of something or someone that is to come. In this case, what we're seeing in this story is Abraham being a type of God, a foreshadow of God, and Isaac being a type of Christ or a foreshadow of Christ. The story all of a sudden just takes on huge depth and huge meaning as we realize that God's heart must be shattered as he is walking through this with Abraham, knowing this is me. This is going to happen to me. Wow. Well, fortunately, Abraham actually doesn't have to go all the way through with it, but God will. So let's move on. Verses 3-8. That should just blow our minds. Let me actually go over to the yeah. Susie's just saying, wow. I know. It hit me the same way. I sat today. I just had tears. I just thought, what kind of God do we have that would do this? I mean, who would enter into this type of pain? His capacity is just mind-blowing. It's just remarkable. Well, verses 3-8 says this. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. He's so obedient, so submissive. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and do what? And worship and come again to you. You can see his faith through what he's saying here. He thinks he is going to sacrifice Isaac. We're told in the New Testament that in his mind, Abraham expected that God would raise him from the dead, even though that had never happened before at this point. He figured that's what God will do because he knows God is faithful to his promises. No longer does he doubt that. So his whole thing is, we're going to go worship and then we're going to come back. He doesn't know how God's going to work this out. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac, his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. And so both of them went together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. He said, behold, the fire and the wood. We have the implements, but where's the lamb for a burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. And so they went, both of them together. So Abraham lays on his son the wood for the sacrifice. Again, I don't even have to say it. The typology here is unbelievable. And God is in all of it, overseeing all of it. And I just can't stress enough. Abraham, he doesn't know. He puts that wood on Isaac's back to carry. He doesn't know that Isaac's future descendant, who will come and be Isaac's substitute as well as Abraham's and everyone who believes on the altar for sin, would also carry his wood to his own sacrifice. So Isaac questions. He says, Dad, we've got the knife, we've got the little pot with the fire so we can light, but we're missing something very important here. We don't have a lamb. Where is the lamb? He's so confused as to what's going on. And Abraham says, don't worry about it, because God is going to provide the lamb. And in that moment, Abraham is prophetic, not just in the short term, but in the long range, that God will provide the lamb, as we're going to read in a moment. But beyond that, that God will provide the lamb. Behold, John the Baptist said, the Lamb of God who comes to take away the sins of the world. Verses 9-12. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. So I have a question for you, group. And here's your question. You can start typing. If God knows everything, the future, what people are going to say, what people are going to do, why did he need Abraham to get to this moment? I mean, God says right here, now I know that you will not withhold your son. I know that you fear me. I know that you love me more because you were willing to do what I asked. But didn't God already know that? So why did God make Abraham and Isaac go through this if he already knew? Or did he already know? Looking forward to reading what you have to say. Yeah, a lot of us we're just in tears over this. Unbelievable. Emily says, God gave us free will. It must be our decision to obey. Excellent. Carolyn says, to see if Abraham would obey. Okay. Excuse me. Karen says, God was testing Abraham's faith. He sure was. No bigger test than that test was there. What about the rest of you? What do you think? Somebody says, that is so amazing. When it said Abraham worshiped, it reminded me of your husband's sermon on how we should always bless the Lord in good times and in hard suffering times. Oh, thank you for saying that. If he's not watching, I'll let Lee know that you remembered that from one of his sermons. Yeah, we think of worship as just sort of relegated to like 3 songs on Sunday morning, 4 if you're lucky. But worship is so much more than that. And often it is really encapsulated in submission and obedience. In fact, I think the highest form of love, quite frankly, is submission, especially when it's something you don't want to do. That is one of the highest forms of love. I'm just hanging out for a second in case I have any more. That was a really tough question, wasn't it? You all have good answers. All right. Well, just to kind of encapsulate what you already just said, I think this was for Abraham's benefit. It was for Isaac's benefit. And because God is a relational God. I mean, you can imagine if you were married to somebody and everything that you said, they were like, I knew you were going to say that. Are you guilty of saying that to your spouse? Because I'm just going to say right now, I am. I am guilty. There have been times I'm like, I knew you were going to say that. I could have written it down ahead of time. I knew that word for word what you were going to say. That just does not sit well with people. Why? Because it just blows up the relationship. You know, like if you already know, then I don't know what we're talking about. There's really nothing left to say here. So God does not treat us like that because he is a relational God. Susie commented, so that Abraham would understand the depth of God's love for those who love and submit to him. I totally agree with you. And really, if you think about it, this is a story that we need to know. And had he just said, well, I know the outcome. I don't need Abraham to go through that because I already know it's going to happen. I'm omniscient, for heaven's sake. Then we would have missed out, right? And Abraham would have missed out on the faith building exercise. And Isaac would have missed out on watching his dad do this. And my goodness, Isaac, he doesn't seem to fight his dad at all. So you have to give him huge credit. Not much is said about that, except that Abraham ties him up and takes the knife and he's ready to slaughter him with it. And Isaac is going to take it. And this is really phenomenal and incredible. I mean, what a story. And it's true. Let's go on to verses 13 to 14. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide. What do you think the chances are that that was the exact place where Jesus was crucified? We're not told. I just have a feeling when I get to heaven, I want to know that information. I just have a feeling the Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord, it shall be provided. Well, God sees his one and only son, his beloved son, as a substitute for sinners. And the picture is complete now in the most holy and righteous way. I mean, when you think about it, had this story ended up with Abraham actually slaughtering his son, we would all sit back and say, so God instructed him to commit murder on an innocent child? I mean, that would be hard, right? Because that seems to go against the nature of God and his holiness. And it would go against the nature of God and his holiness, which is why it doesn't happen. It reminds me of the story what we talked about way back in the book of Luke, where we said Jesus both ate the Passover meal and was the Passover lamb. And he did it all according to the law. He didn't miss one single thing. And God worked all the details so that Jesus could both eat the Passover and be the Passover lamb. Rather miraculous. The same thing happens here, where all of a sudden Isaac is no longer the type of Christ. That type, that foreshadow shifts onto the ram. That's just an adult male lamb. And that ram is now foreshadowing that substitute for a sinner, because Isaac was, and so was Abraham. We all deserve death. And God said, I will provide a substitute for you. And ultimately, that ram, that lamb of God, will be Jesus Christ, who will carry the wood for the sacrifice on his back up the same mountain that you're looking at right here. And God, in his omniscience and in his glory and in his compassion and wisdom, sits back and creates a picture of what he's going to do 2,000 years later. God is the most incredible communicator. I mean, that's just an understatement. Like, how do you even say the most incredible communicator? And so often he gives us pictures, but it's almost like a picture in a picture in a picture in a picture. Like there's levels, there's layers to the picture. And this is one of those. Let me end by just saying this. Abraham, he didn't know the fullness of what was going on here at all. In Abraham's mind, God asked him to do the unthinkable, which was to go and sacrifice his son, his only son, his beloved son. And in Abraham's mind, we're told in the New Testament that he figured, well, God will resurrect him because he said that he would be the son of promise, and Isaac has no offspring, so he can't die. So I guess God is going to do something like that through this. And so Abraham just follows God, submits, obeys, does but he does not know. He doesn't know at this moment. I'm sure not until eternity, not till he got to heaven, did he have the foggiest idea what this moment encapsulated. And again, I sat back and I thought, how much of what is happening in our lives and what is going on around us will we someday, maybe in eternity, look back on and go, oh my goodness, God, I had no idea what you were doing there. I had no idea what the grand picture was. I did not know generations to come would experience something based on what you were doing in my life at that time. God is so far beyond us. He's so far beyond our comprehension. He's so sovereign over everything, and he's so trustworthy. We can trust him even when what he asks us to do seems so unthinkable. And I'm smiling because I just went over to the comments, and the first thing I see is Judy saying, God can be trusted. Exactly. It's exactly what I'm trying to say. Thank you for that. Well, we will pick it up here next week, and we have a lot more great stuff coming up in Genesis. We're not even halfway through Genesis yet, 50 chapters. We're in chapter 22. So I hope that you can join us next Monday night, 9 p.m. Eastern time on Bible Study Hub. That's live both on Facebook and on YouTube. And of course, if you ever need to catch up on one that you missed, YouTube is the easiest place to do that because they're nice and neat and in order, where Facebook is, kind of a mess. So join us whenever. All right. Well, I love you all. I pray for you. I hope that you have a wonderful week. Thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate you. And I will see you next Monday night, 9 p.m. Eastern time, if not before.